Hi guys, my name is Sukaja and I'm excited to share the top 5 books I read in 2020. I read a total of 27 books in the year 2020. Out of these 27, there were only 5 books that I really enjoyed. So in this video, I'm going to take you through these 5 amazing books that I think are definitely worth your time. So without further ado, let's get started. The first book that I found to be a very unique read and something that fell along the lines of the secret history and the genre of dark academia, which is something I really enjoy, is Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss. So this book is about a group of people who try to imbibe the way of life that existed back in the Iron Age in England. It's about this research group and this professor who is a professor of archaeology, and how they try to embark on this social experiment where they decide to live like the way the Stone Age people lived back in the day. This is a story about this one girl who is swept into this because her dad is somebody who has done a lot of research, read a lot of books about it. So he decides to help the professor embark on this experiment, and she, being his daughter, gets sucked into it, except that the problem with this is that the father is a little carried away with the whole idea and he wants to do everything exactly by the books and live exactly the way they did until the last detail, which means he wants to dress in rags and he wants his wife to cook meals in like really primitive conditions, and he wants his daughter to go and scavenge. They won't even for a minute consider buying food from the supermarket because they are living very seriously as people did in this Iron Age. But the problem with this is that what starts off as a very innocent social experiment ends up becoming very dark and starts to reveal things about the family that are very dysfunctional. So that's what this book is about. Definitely not for the faint-hearted. It raises a whole lot of questions. It's a very thin book, but at the same time is packed with so much of interesting stuff. So I highly recommend reading Sarah Moss's Ghost Wall, and she's also written Summer Water, which is a sequel to this book, which I plan to read. Summer Water is again something that deals with similar themes. So I found this extremely interesting in terms of the subject matter. I really enjoyed this. This is definitely in my top 5 for 2020. The next book is Washington Black by S.E. Ejjukian. This was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize in the year 2018. This book is about adventure at its core, and it's also about this person who is born a slave who is somehow swept into this miraculous expedition. It's about science. It's definitely historic fiction, but it's about this engineer who's into aeronautics, and he designs this ship that you can use to fly. And it's a boat, but it's an aerial boat. So the kid gets the chance to escape from his life on the plantation because he's selected to be an assistant for this aeronautical engineer. I found that to be terribly interesting, and this was definitely an unputdownable book. It was so engrossing, and I felt like I was there on the plantation looking at the lives of these people. It doesn't deal with slavery as such so much as it does with science and advancement, but at the same time it's a story of 2 English brothers in Barbados, and it's so fast-paced and full of adventure. It's been a while since I read this, and I definitely think I should give this a reread, but it takes you everywhere from Barbados to United States and Canada to the Arctics and London as well. There's a lot of travel in here. It's just fantastic, and I recommend reading this as well for those who love adventure. The other book that I read this year that is in my top 5 is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This book is brilliant. It is the best classic that I have read. Not that I've read too many, but this is something I recommend for any of you who feel hesitant to start reading classics. This is a good place to start. This book is about a woman who is like very plain, and she doesn't really have too much going on. She doesn't really have too much of a personality, and she decides to, she's just hanging out in a hotel in Morocco when one day it just so turns out that a very handsome man comes to the hotel, and suddenly she's swept off her feet, and within a week she decides to take things pretty fast and marry him. And she's enamored by the fact that he has this mansion called Manderley, which is mythologized because as a kid she had seen that in the photographs and postcards of her childhood. So she's always wanted to go live there, and once she gets to marry him, she gets sucked into this whole history that exists. There's a lot of gothic elements in this book, and the house is filled with this absent presence, this sort of haunting by the previous mistress of the house, who is Rebecca. This book is about how this woman is not confident, and she's constantly feeling insecure and constantly feels that she won't match up to being the amazing mistress that used to head the whole household, and she was such a good homemaker and all of that, and she gets this complex, and it's all in her head, and she's definitely an overthinker. But then it's about how she needs to work with that and overcome that back in the 19th century in England. I absolutely love this. It's super atmospheric and very fast-paced again, filled with a lot of details that you might miss, so you need to pay attention closely, and then it's great for a book club discussion. There are so many different ways to interpret what happens in this book, and the characters are phenomenal. I loved the character of the housekeeper, who is slightly creepy, and there are a lot of creepy people in here. What turns out to be an innocent story of a marriage ends up becoming very dark, and you realize that it's not about ghosts as much as it's people who do the hauntings. It's brilliant, and I highly recommend reading this novel. The fourth book that I really enjoyed this year is A Gentleman in Moscow, which was recommended to me by a couple of people over on Instagram, and I have no regrets reading this book. It is a very thick book, but it was super enjoyable, and I highly recommend reading this if you ever have a down moment, and if the coming year, God forbid, brings upon us many hours of like self-isolation, then this is a book you can pick up, because it is about a man who used to be a very rich count who overnight ends up getting stripped of all his titles. He is reduced to having to live on very low means, and he is forced to be in the top floor attic of a hotel which is at the center of Moscow. The name of the hotel is Metropole, and he just has to live like that by himself, away from everybody and the outside world. He's supposed to be in exile within his own city, and this is a very interesting idea because a lot of people get exiled outside of their countries, and here it's much more painful to be a very patriotic person and somebody who loves the country that they're born in, and then being forced to live inside a hotel is just really debilitating. But then the Count is a very lovable character, and his outlook is extremely optimistic. So you do feel like giving him a warm hug, because he seems like this amazing, phenomenal character that you want to embody in every possible way, especially in terms of his outlook and his spirit. And it is possible to be happy in any circumstances, what this book kind of tells you, because there's always a plus side to everything. So I really like this. It's great to discuss with friends, and there are some very memorable characters who make appearances here. The kind of friendships that develop in this book are very sweet, and it is very natural. It feels very real, like such a thing could have actually taken place. Again, it is historic fiction, and it is set during the post-Russian Revolution era. I just absolutely enjoyed this. It is perfect for history buffs. It is perfect for people who love to savor a book, who don't like to rush through books. And if you have the time, you should definitely pick this up. About a gentleman and somebody whom you will end up having a lot of respect for, and somebody whom you'd want to meet in real life, perhaps. A very lovable character indeed. So I highly recommend reading A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. Right. The next book and the final book was the book that I read in December, and it turned out to be probably my most favorite book of the year, and that is Miss Benson's Beetle by Rachel Joyce. This is another very comfortable book, and something that definitely feels like a warm hug when you read it, just like The Gentleman in Moscow. So it turns out that during the most trying time, I ended up reaching out to books that were very comforting, and I subconsciously did that. So I'm really glad that I was able to read these sorts of books, and they taught me so much. This is historic fiction again, so for historic fiction buffs, please take some time to read this book. This one is a story of friendship between two women, and again it's set in the 1900s, and it takes us to this island called New Caledonia, which is a part of the Australian continent. So it is very close to Australia, and it was at one point part of British territory. This is about a British woman who goes there looking for the golden beetle. It's really fast-paced and full of adventure. So if you want like a quick escape, something that transports you from your current sitting room into a wild tropical terrain, where you're literally on all fours going around with a magnifying glass looking for a beetle, you should definitely pick this up. The cover did not disappoint me. The summary did not mislead me. This is the kind of book that went exactly the way I expected it to go, and it just didn't disappoint me in any way. So I highly recommend this. This is a well-written, well-thought-out book. I felt like the writer put so much care into every single decision she made her characters take. So it felt like a really well-done work. I had previously read The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry by Rachel Joyce, which also I thoroughly enjoyed, and it felt like a warm hug. But this just has such lovable characters. There's such a lot of quirk and a lot of contemporary imagery inside this. So there are women here that you really want to appreciate and like you grow to love, because despite them being very hoity-toity or being too full of themselves, even though they have certain flaws and they're very flawed, you still grow to appreciate them and you really love them. You learn a lot about beetles in the process, and you learn about what discovery and science and botany, the study of beetles was like back in the day. It's humorous, and there are moments when you feel like, is this really possible? But then you want to believe that it's possible because you want to know what happens, and there's so much suspense that you decide to believe it anyway and go ahead with the story. And I think that is again an art that very few authors are able to accomplish in fiction. You know, letting the person reading the work, making them want to believe things, even though you're edging between, you know, that thin line where it's very easy for people to lose their belief in what the story is trying to tell you and be like, this could never happen in real life. But then there is that fine line, and I think she's like mastered that, and she's brilliant. I absolutely love this book. It was absolutely flawless to me, and I loved the characters, I loved the atmosphere, I loved the setting. And New Caledonia actually exists on the map, so it is very interesting for somebody who loves geography and like history and adventure and feministy writing in fiction. So yeah, highly recommend reading this. In fact, this year was so good. Let me know all the books that you read this year and which are your favorites down in the comment section. I would love to hear from you. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. I will be back with more bookish videos. But in the meantime, hang in there, stay safe, stay sane, and keep reading. Bye!